Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. It was a gloomy afternoon when Mark and I first laid eyes on the house. The mist rolled over the hills like an eerie blanket, swallowing the towering silhouette of the old Victorian mansion in its embrace. I could feel my heart flutter as we approached. This was going to be it. The place we'd start our new life together. I remember the air being damp, like the house itself had been waiting for us, hidden under the shroud of 1,000 untold stories. The trees surrounding it, bare, twisted, seemed to reach out, clawing at the sky, their barren branches scraping the air as though they had something to say, but no one could hear. Mark stood beside me, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, as if trying to shield himself from something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He wasn't as thrilled as I was. I could tell by the way his eyes darted back and forth, studying the house like a puzzle he didn't want to solve. I was excited, though. No, more than excited, I was drawn to it. This house, with its crooked chimneys and faded paint, felt like the perfect place for us to make a home. There was history here. There were stories waiting to be written. Is this it? Mark's voice pulled me from my thoughts, dry and a little tired, as if he already knew what my answer would be. I grinned, not at all discouraged by the way he was eyeing the place. Isn't it perfect? We took a few steps toward the front gate, which creaked open reluctantly, as if it didn't quite want us inside. The path was uneven, cobblestone strewn with layers of age and neglect, but I didn't mind. Every inch of this place called to me. Mark, on the other hand, wasn't as thrilled. I could feel his discomfort in the way he moved, cautious, scanning every detail, like he was looking for a reason to turn back. "This place looks like it's going to fall apart," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I waved my hand dismissively, eager to explore. "It's full of character, Mark. It just needs some love, that's all. Imagine what we could do with it. Just picture it." The house loomed in front of us, towering with that quiet grace old buildings have. I could already see the changes I'd make, the potential, the charm. Everything was perfect for me, for us. This would be the start of something wonderful. As we stepped onto the porch, I couldn't help but feel the house wasn't just there. It was alive, watching us, waiting. I didn't mention it to Mark, though. He was already on edge, and I didn't want to make him feel more uncomfortable than he already did. But as I reached for the brass knocker on the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the air had shifted. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The door creaked, its voice an old groan, as if it had been waiting for us to arrive. Inside, the house greeted us with its cold embrace. Everything seemed still, heavy with secrets. The floorboards creaked as we made our way through the entryway, and the air felt thick, like the walls had absorbed the echoes of everything that had ever happened here. I wanted to explore every inch, but something caught my eye. At the end of the hallway there was a door, old, worn, but completely sealed off. No handle, just thick bolts keeping it shut. "What do you think that is?" I asked Mark, my curiosity bubbling over. He glanced over, squinting at the door. Could be just an old storage closet, or maybe a room they didn't want to use. Who knows? But there was something strange about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a storage closet. Why would it be bolted shut like that, with no way to open it? Why hadn't anyone bothered to clear the debris or at least give us an explanation? I tried to push it out of my mind as we wandered further into the house, but the door stayed with me. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl, even as I told myself it was just an old house quirk. That night, as we settled in, I heard it. A knock. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, old wood groaning, perhaps the wind pushing at the walls. But no, this was something different. This was intentional. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't loud, it wasn't frightening. At least, not at first. But it was rhythmic, steady, deliberate. And I couldn't help but feel that it was coming from the other side of that sealed door. I looked at Mark, and he looked at me. His face was pale, eyes wide with concern. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "It's coming from behind the door." Mark sighed, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just the house. You know how these old places are, the wind, the settling." But as the knocks grew louder, more insistent, I couldn't help but feel pulled to it. My curiosity had been ignited. It was as if the house was calling me, beckoning me to find out what lay beyond that door. I needed to know. "Maybe we should check it out," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper, though part of me was terrified. Mark didn't respond. He didn't have to. He knew as well as I did that there was something more to this house than we had bargained for. But neither of us could resist. The door was calling us, and we were drawn in, helpless. That night, we didn't just hear the knocks. The house had already begun to speak, and I was beginning to understand that some doors, some places should never be opened. I don't know what came over me that night. Maybe it was the way the house had been quietly whispering its secrets to me, or maybe it was just the nagging feeling that I couldn't escape, that there was something hidden behind that door. I had tried to ignore it. I really had, but the curiosity grew, gnawing at me like an itch that couldn't be scratched. I remember the silence that hung heavy in the air, almost thick enough to taste. Mark and I had settled into the living room, the only sound between us the crackling of the fire and the soft hum of the old house settling in for the night. But it wasn't just the house that was settling. It was the unease in my chest, a strange tension that made me fidget. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt wrong. Almost like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to make the first move. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The door. The one that had been sealed shut. The one that I had tried to ignore at first, convinced it was just another quirk of the house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something about it, something off. And now, it was all I could think about. Mark looked over at me from the couch, his brow furrowing as I stood up, my gaze fixed on the hallway. He knew. He had to know where I was going. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the way he tried to hide the fear that was creeping in. But he didn't stop me. He didn't say a word. "I'm going to open it," I whispered more to myself than to him. Mark's eyes widened. "Rachel, no," he said, his voice tight. "We don't know what's behind there. What if it's dangerous?" I barely heard him. I was already walking toward the hallway, each step pulling me closer to the thing that had been calling to me. The door stood there at the end of the hall, almost mocking me, its bolts gleaming in the dim light of the house. The wood was old, cracked, as though it had been waiting for years to be touched. The air around it felt heavier than the rest of the house, like it was wrapped in a quiet, oppressive darkness. I stopped in front of it, my breath catching in my throat. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the bolts, feeling the weight of them, the years of dust and neglect that had accumulated on the rusted surface. It was almost like the house was warning me, urging me to stop before I made a mistake. But I couldn't stop, not now. I gripped the first bolt, pulling at it with all my strength. It resisted at first, Then with a groan, it loosened. The sound echoed in the silence of the house, a harsh, metallic noise that made my skin crawl. I could feel Mark behind me now, his footsteps hesitant, almost afraid to come any closer. I knew he wanted to stop me, but he wasn't going to. He knew as well as I did that it was too late. With a shaky breath, I twisted the second bolt free. It fell away with a hollow clink, and I could feel the air in the hallway shift. I glanced over my shoulder, but Mark hadn't moved. His face was pale, eyes wide with something I couldn't quite read, fear, maybe. But there was something else too, something darker, something that told me he had been thinking the same thing. The house wasn't just old, it was alive. It had its own heartbeat, its own rhythm, and it was waiting for me to open this door. I hesitated for just a moment, staring at the handle. My hand hovered above it, and for the briefest of moments I considered stopping. What if Mark was right? What if I was wrong? What if there was something in there that I couldn't handle? But that nagging feeling, the one that had been growing since we moved in, was louder now. I had to know what lay beyond that door. There was no going back. I turned the handle. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, its hinges groaning like something ancient, something that hadn't been touched in years. The sound seemed to echo for miles, stretching out into the house, as if the walls themselves were protesting the intrusion. What I saw when I stepped inside made my blood run cold. It was a room, a perfect replica of the house. Everything was the same furniture, the same layout. But something was wrong. The colors were drained, muted, like the life had been sucked out of the place. The air was thick, almost choking, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. It was colder, too, the temperature dropping the moment I crossed the threshold. I stepped further in, my feet hesitant against the dusty floor. The room felt like a mirror of the one we had left behind, but it wasn't. I could feel it. There was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then I saw them. Figures, standing motionless at the far side of the room. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was us, but not us. The figures had our faces, my face, Mark's face, but they were wrong. The smiles were too wide, too perfect. Their eyes gleamed with an unnatural gleam, devoid of warmth, of life. They didn't speak, they didn't move. They just stood there, smiling at us, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. My legs felt weak, my body unwilling to move. "Mark, do you see them?" But he didn't answer. I looked back over my shoulder to find him frozen, his eyes wide with horror. I could see the realization slowly creeping into his face, the terror building up behind his gaze. And then, one of them, it, spoke. "We've been waiting for you." The words were like a punch to the gut. They echoed through the room, deep and distorted, as if they were coming from somewhere far away. The smile on the doppelganger's face stretched even wider, an almost unnatural thing, like it could never stop. The air around me grew colder, thicker. I took a step back, but it was no use. The door I had just opened had not been meant to free us. It had been meant to trap us. The house had been waiting. And now, there was no turning back. The night felt wrong. There's no other way to describe it. Wrong. The house, which had once felt like a strange, uninviting beauty, now felt like something else. Like it was watching us. Waiting. The air was thick, heavy, as if the walls were closing in. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the corners of my vision, just out of reach. Mark and I were sitting in the living room, trying to ignore the growing tension between us. We tried to pretend that everything was fine. that we were just adjusting to the house, getting used to its strange creaks and groans, to its silence that stretched for miles. But it wasn't fine. Something wasn't right. I remember the way the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. But the warmth from the flames didn't reach us. The house was cold, unnervingly cold. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from just an old building. No, this was something different. It felt alive somehow. It felt like it was breathing in sync with us, inhaling and exhaling in the dark. The stillness in the room stretched, each moment thicker than the last. I couldn't focus on the conversation anymore. I couldn't even focus on the fire. My eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, the door at the end of the hall, the sealed one, the one I'd tried to forget about. But I couldn't. And then it started. A soft knock, 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 knock. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at Mark, and I saw it. The moment when his face went pale, his body stiffening as he heard it too. The sound wasn't from the outside. It wasn't the wind rattling the windows or the house settling on its old bones. No, this was something deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. My heart started to race, pounding in my ears. The knocking was steady, almost rhythmic. It seemed to echo from the hallway, from behind that door, the door we had never opened, the one that had been bolted shut for years. My skin crawled. I could feel the cold seeping deeper into my bones. "Mark," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I could see the look on his face, his eyes wide, his mouth a thin line. He heard it too. The knock was getting louder now, closer, more urgent, as if someone on the other side was trying to get in. I stood up, my legs shaky, my breath shallow. I felt the pull in my chest, the same pull I'd felt the moment I'd laid eyes on that door. It was like the house was calling me, pulling me toward it, urging me to find out what lay behind it. "Maybe it's nothing," Mark said, his voice tight, trying to reassure both of us. But even he didn't sound convinced. His eyes were darting toward the hallway, toward the door. It could be the wind, the house settling. But I knew it wasn't the wind, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I moved slowly, cautiously toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. The knocking followed me, getting louder with every footstep. I could hear it now, like a drumbeat in my head. It was louder than the wind, louder than the fire crackling behind us. It was real, and it was coming from that door. Mark followed me, reluctantly, his hand hovering at his side, but he didn't stop me. He couldn't. He was drawn in too, just like I was. We were both helpless. When I reached the door, my hand hovered over the handle. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. The knocking was still there, more frantic now, pounding against my eardrums, and my heart was racing. My palms were clammy, my fingers shaking. I could hear Mark's breathing behind me, but he didn't speak. He didn't even move. The only sound in the house was the knocking. I reached for the bolt. The metal was cold to the touch, rusted from years of disuse. I could feel the resistance as I twisted the bolt, but I didn't stop. The sound of it sliding out was loud in the stillness, like a metallic scream in the dead of night. The door groaned as if it was waking from a long slumber, as if it had been waiting for this moment. And then, silence. The knocking stopped. The house was still. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing came. For a moment it felt like the entire house had held its breath, waiting for me to open that door, and I had. Now the air was thick, suffocating. The house didn't seem to be the same anymore. It felt heavier, as if something had shifted. I pushed the door open, just a crack, and the air inside hit me like a wave of cold, stale air that nearly knocked me back. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from an open window or the chill of night. No, this was different. This was an unnatural cold, as if the air in that room had been locked away for far too long. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you feel that?" He didn't answer at first. I looked back at him, and I saw it then, the terror. The realization that he knew too, that something was wrong. He stepped forward, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the door. I could see his hand trembling as he reached for the handle, but the moment he touched it, the door slammed shut. The sound of it reverberated through the house, echoing through every inch of my body. I stared at the door, wide-eyed, my breath caught in my throat. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't Mark's, it wasn't mine, it was something else, something darker. "We've been waiting for you." The voice wasn't loud, it was soft, calm, but it was full of something I couldn't name. It was as if the house itself had spoken to us. Mark's face turned even paler. I saw the horror flood into his eyes. He took a step back, but it was already too late. The house wasn't just settling. It was alive. And we had just opened the door to something that had been waiting for us all along. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if the air itself had thickened, the walls drawn closer, the very space pressing in around me. There was a weight in the silence, a pressure that had settled into my chest ever since we opened that damn door. Mark and I were standing in the living room, a few feet apart, but it felt like there was an ocean of distance between us. He was looking at me, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine, as if he couldn't bear to look any longer. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, clawing its way out. The knocking had stopped, but it didn't matter. The house was still alive, still waiting. The room itself felt alive, filled with a tension I couldn't escape. We had made the mistake of opening that door, and now I had to face the consequences. And Mark, poor Mark, he wasn't ready to confront it. I could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty in the way his body trembled. I couldn't blame him, I felt it too. I don't know what to do, Rachel, Mark said, his voice shaking. We've seen it. We've opened the door, and I don't know what's worse, what's behind it or what we've already let loose. I didn't have an answer for him. The words were stuck in my throat, but I knew the truth. We couldn't run. The house had already chosen us. There was no walking away from this. Not now, not after what we'd done. I turned toward the hallway, toward that cursed door. The bolt was still loose, the door slightly ajar. My hand reached out before I could stop it. My fingers brushed the cold wood, and a shiver ran through me. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This wasn't just some silly fear of the unknown. No, this was something far deeper. Something the house had been building since we first walked through the front door. It had drawn us in. We had opened that door. And now we had to face it. "I'm scared, too," I whispered to him, though I wasn't sure if he could hear me. My voice felt so small, so fragile in the vast emptiness of the house. "But we have to go back. We have to find out what's behind that door. We can't just leave it like this." Mark shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "We can't just face it, Rachel. What if it's too much? What if it's—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. The words were too much. We both knew it. Whatever was behind that door wasn't just some harmless curiosity. It wasn't just a trick of the house, a draft, a creaking floorboard. No, it was something darker, something ancient. And it had been waiting for us. It had been waiting for this moment. But I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let it go. The house, that thing behind the door, it wanted us to open it. It wanted us to walk straight into its trap. And we had walked right into it, just like the house had wanted. We have to face it. Together, I said, my voice stronger now, though my insides were trembling with fear. Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. I could feel the weight of the decision between us, the burden that was too heavy to carry. The only choice we had now was to go forward. My legs were shaking as I walked toward the hallway, every step feeling like it was dragging me deeper into the house. I could feel Mark following behind me, and I didn't have to look back to know that he was scared. But he was here. He was going to face it with me, whether he liked it or not. The air grew colder with each step. It was suffocating. I could feel the house pressing in from all sides. I wasn't just walking down a hallway anymore. I was walking through something alive. I could feel the floorboards beneath me creaking, groaning, as if the house was making its last protest before we went too far. I reached the door. It loomed before me, dark and foreboding. The knock had stopped, but the silence in the house was deafening. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to open it. I had to. Mark stood behind me now, barely making a sound. I didn't dare look back at him. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't need to see him. I just needed to focus on the door, on what came next. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." There was a long pause, then the sound of Mark's breath, shallow, like he was trying to find the courage to speak. "Together," he repeated quietly. I turned the handle. The door creaked, a low, mournful sound, as if it were in pain. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The door swung open slowly, agonizingly slowly, as if it had been waiting for me to push it. And as it opened, the darkness beyond seemed to reach for us, pulling at my soul, suffocating everything in its wake. I stepped inside. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. The air felt like ice against my skin, and every breath I took came out in a cloud of mist. The darkness in the room was so thick, so absolute, that I could barely see anything. But I could feel it. I could feel the presence, heavy and suffocating. Mark was beside me now, his body rigid, his hand trembling as it brushed against mine. I could feel him fighting the same terror I was fighting, the same pull toward the unknown. The presence in the room was growing stronger, and I knew that it was aware of us. It was waiting. The door slammed shut behind us, and the sound echoed through the house, ringing like a death knell. And then I heard it. A whisper, soft but insistent. "We've been waiting for you." It was not a voice I recognized. It wasn't Mark's. It wasn't mine. It was something else, something far darker, something that had been waiting for us, for this moment. Mark froze. His grip tightened on my hand, but he didn't speak. The room was cold, too cold. And the presence, that terrible weight that had been hanging in the air, it was closing in on us. It was real. It was alive. And we had just opened the door to it. And now we had no choice but to face it. I wish I could say that I was ready for what we found behind that door. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight that greeted us when we stepped inside. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just too shaken by everything that had already happened. By the knocking, the door, the doppelgangers. But no, this place, this room, it was too familiar. It was our living room, but not. The air felt heavier, colder, and the once inviting worn edges of our house felt twisted here. Something sinister lurking behind the familiarity. I stepped in, my heart pounding in my chest, and I felt Mark freeze beside me. He didn't need to say a word. I could see it in his face, the same dawning horror that was starting to sink into mine. The room looked like ours, sure. The same couch sat in the same spot, the same rug on the floor, the same worn wooden beams above. But it was off. The walls were too faded, the colors drained, like someone had stripped the life out of everything that should have been warm and comforting. The couch was covered in dust, untouched, the fabric a dull shade that it shouldn't have been. The rug was faded and worn, like it had been there for ages, like it had seen countless feet tread across it but had never been cleaned. But it wasn't just the furniture, it was the air. The air was thick, unnaturally thick, like the weight of the room itself was pressing down on me. And that's when I realized something wasn't right. It wasn't a reflection of our home. It was a distortion, a corruption of it. And then I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But no, the figures in front of us were too solid, too real. They were standing there, right in the center of the room, perfectly still, perfectly watching us. And then, my blood went cold. It was us. I could see it clearly, the shape, the posture, even the way they stood, their faces, my face, Mark's face, were twisted into something that looked like a reflection but wasn't. Something was wrong. They were too perfect, too still. Their smiles were wide, unnaturally wide, stretched too far across their faces like grotesque caricatures. And their eyes, they gleamed, but there was no warmth in them, only hunger. My heart stopped for a moment, my feet freezing to the floor. I wanted to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't listen. The doppelganger Mark took a step forward, and I saw it, the hunger in his eyes. He smiled, and the smile was so sharp, so wrong, that I felt my skin crawl. "We've been waiting for you," one of them said. The voice, my voice, echoed in the room, but it wasn't me speaking. It was a distorted version of me. It was darker, deeper, cold, hollow. Mark squeezed my hand, but I barely felt it. My breath was shallow, too shallow. I could feel the air pressing down on me, thick with the weight of this twisted version of our home. The house was alive, watching, listening. It was waiting. "We've been waiting for you," the doppelganger said again, its smile widening, stretching inhumanly wide. The words didn't make sense, but somehow they did. The house wasn't just old, it wasn't just abandoned. This place had been waiting for us. It had called us here. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, I wanted to break free from the nightmare closing in around us, but my legs were paralyzed. The room, the mirror house, was closing in. The doppelganger Mark took another step forward. He reached out his hand, and I saw the twisted hunger in his eyes. He was moving too fast now, his steps too eager. "It's time," he whispered. "It's time to take what's ours." And that's when the last pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't a mirror house. It wasn't just a distorted version of our home. This was the house. This was where we had been drawn to. We had opened the door and crossed the threshold, and now there was no going back. "We're you," the other doppelganger said, stepping closer, its smile never fading. "And now, we take your place." The words, the sound of it, twisted, like they were coming from a far-off place, like they didn't belong in this world, hit me like a punch to the gut. The house was alive. These weren't just distorted versions of us, they were us. Twisted, hungry, waiting. And the house had been waiting for the right time to let them out. But now they were free, and there was no escaping them. I tried to scream, but the air was too thick. My chest was tight, my throat burning. Mark was beside me, frozen in place. He didn't move. He couldn't. The figures, our doppelgangers, took another step closer, their hands outstretched, their smiles widening. I didn't know what to do. We had opened the door, we had released them. And now there was no escape. The room around me was closing in, the air so cold that I could feel the chill biting into my skin. The floor felt like it was shifting beneath my feet, as though the house was swallowing us whole. The figures, the twisted versions of us, were moving closer, their steps slow and deliberate, their eyes fixed on us. The house was no longer a place. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity, and we were the prey. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the suffocating silence. And in that moment I understood. We had walked into the mirror house. And now, we were the ones trapped. It was impossible to breathe. The air had turned thick, suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides, and I could feel my chest tightening with each shallow breath. I couldn't focus. My vision blurred, the edges of the room slipping away as my mind struggled to process what was happening. Everything felt wrong, too wrong. The walls seemed to shift, the air seemed to pulse, and the shadows in the corners of the room felt alive, crawling toward us, crawling toward me. I turned to Mark, hoping for something, anything that would tell me this was all some twisted nightmare, some terrible misunderstanding. But no, the look in his eyes, it wasn't him anymore. It was as if his very soul had been replaced, swapped out for something else. His face, my face, stared back at me, but the eyes, they were empty, no warmth, no recognition. I felt it then, the terrible, sickening truth that twisted my stomach into knots. It wasn't just that the doppelgangers looked like us. They didn't just mirror us, they were us, but worse. They had been waiting for us, waiting for the door to be opened, waiting for the perfect moment to take over the house. It had been waiting for us. A pit formed in my stomach as the truth came crashing down on me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just some haunted house. This wasn't some abandoned relic filled with dust and secrets. No, this place, this house, it wasn't a home. It was alive. And we were never meant to find it. We weren't supposed to open that door. But we had. And now, the house was taking us. It was trapping us, turning us into them. The doppelganger Mark stepped closer to me, his grin widening, and I saw it. There was nothing human left in his face. Only hunger, a desire, a need to take what wasn't theirs, to take my life, to take us. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his voice a twisted echo of Mark's. But it wasn't Mark. No, this was something darker, something wrong. The voice was cold, sharp, stripped of everything that made him human, the voice of something else. And in that moment I understood. It wasn't just the house that had been waiting. It was them, the doppelgangers. These twisted versions of us were not simply reflections. They were us, but corrupted, turned into something that wanted to replace us. And we had opened the door for them. We had let them out. I could feel it in my bones, in the marrow of my very being. The house had been waiting. The doppelgangers had been waiting for this moment. They had been locked away for so long, confined to that twisted mirror of a house, and we had released them. I could feel the weight of the house closing in on us. The walls seemed to constrict, the air growing colder, thicker. I wanted to scream, to run, to flee, but where could I go? There was no escape. "We are you," the other doppelganger, the one who looked like me, said, stepping forward with that same twisted smile. "And now, it's time for you to take your place." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to run, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't move. It felt like my feet were stuck in concrete, like I was being dragged toward them by some invisible force. It was as if the house itself was tightening its grip on us, pulling us toward the fate that had been sealed the moment we stepped into this nightmare. I could hear the doppelganger Mark's voice again, low and almost playful. but twisted with something so dark, so hungry. "Don't worry, darling. You'll love what we've done with your life. You'll be just like us." My breath caught in my throat. My chest felt like it was being crushed. The suffocating pressure was unbearable. I turned back to Mark, my Mark, but he was already slipping away. His face was the same, but it wasn't. His eyes were empty, cold. It was as if he had been replaced, taken over, and now, I was the one who was being replaced. "Mark, please," I gasped, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Please, tell me you're still in there." But the thing that stood in front of me, wearing his face, only smiled. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its eyes told me everything. It wasn't Mark. It was something else, something wrong. The house had been waiting. The doppelgangers had been waiting. And now we had crossed the point of no return. We had opened the door, and in doing so, we had unleashed them. They were us, and they were going to take everything we had. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But the truth settled into me like a heavy stone. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it had a mind of its own. The moment we opened that door, we had sealed our fate. There was no escaping it now. We were trapped in the house, the real house, and whatever lay on the other side of the door, the mirror world, was now ours, and we were the ones who were trapped in it. I never thought this would happen. I didn't think we were really in danger, not at first. I thought it was just a story, a twist of fate, something that would go away if we just left it alone. But the moment those twisted versions of us stepped closer, their eyes gleaming with that hunger, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. The air in the room was so thick, it felt like I was breathing through wet cotton. Every breath was harder than the last, like I was suffocating, trapped in this place I couldn't escape. My body felt heavy, almost like I wasn't even in control anymore. I tried to move, tried to run, but it was like my legs were glued to the floor. I couldn't even make a sound. The doppelganger Mark's hand reached out for me, and I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost, trapped in my chest. It wasn't just the house. No, this was something worse. The house had been waiting. We had unlocked it. We had let it out, let the doppelgangers out. But we weren't just facing them, they were us. "We've been waiting for you," the other me, the thing that wore my face, said, its voice distorted, hollow. It sounded like me, but it wasn't me. It was wrong. It was deeper, colder, like a shadow of everything I had ever been. The words echoed through the room, but they weren't words. They were like a whisper from a nightmare, crawling into my ears, digging into my soul. And that's when I understood. The horror hit me all at once, crashing through my chest like a wave, suffocating me. I wasn't just in a nightmare. I wasn't just trapped in a house. No, the switch was already happening. The moment we opened that door, I had released them. They weren't just here. They had been waiting. I looked at Mark. I wanted to say his name, to reach for him, to make him understand. But when I saw him standing there, eyes wide with fear, it hit me with gut-wrenching clarity. Mark wasn't Mark anymore. We weren't us anymore. The thing that looked like me was getting closer, its twisted smile widening with each step. I could see it in its eyes. The hunger, the need to take everything that had once been mine. My body, my life, my face. The house was closing in. The walls seemed to shift, the air turning colder with every second. And before I could think, before I could scream, I felt it, the pull. The house wasn't just a place. It was an entity, alive, breathing, and it had chosen us for this moment. The doppelganger Mark reached out and touched me, my face. But it wasn't me. I wasn't me anymore. "We are you," it said, and its voice was a twisted mockery of my own. "It's time to take your place." My legs gave out from under me. I wanted to fall, to collapse, but my body wouldn't listen. The house had already taken me, taken my will. I could feel it, deep inside me, slowly slipping away. The world around me twisted again, the room, the walls, everything that had once felt familiar. It was all fading. I could hear the doppelganger Mark's voice, my voice, laughing softly behind me, his hands gripping me, his fingers too cold, too tight. "We are you," it said again, and I could feel my mind start to slip, like I was drowning in my own body. "It's time to be you." The world flickered, like a broken reflection in water. I saw myself, the thing wearing my face, take a step forward, and then I realized the awful truth. The switch had happened. I had become them, and they had become me. I wasn't in control anymore. My body, my voice, it wasn't mine. I could see myself from the outside, moving as if I were a puppet, strings pulled by something darker, something ancient. And as I felt the last part of myself slip away, I realized that I was no longer Rachel. I was them. The house had won, the doppelgangers had won, we had been replaced, and there was no way out. I never thought it would come to this. I never imagined that after everything we had been through, everything we had seen, this would be the end. But somehow, as I stood there, my chest tightening with every breath, I knew there was no escape. The house, the real house, had finally revealed its true nature. It wasn't just a place. It wasn't just an old, creepy building with a history of strange happenings. No, it was something darker, something alive, something that had been waiting. And we had been the perfect ones to take. The air in the room grew even heavier, as though it were pressing down on me, suffocating me with its weight. I wanted to move, to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey, my legs wouldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight as if invisible chains were binding me to this cursed place. I looked at the doppelgangers, the others, who wore our faces. They were standing there, still, watching us. Watching me. Their smiles never faltered, but it wasn't our smiles. It was a twisted version of us. Cold, hungry, empty. One of them, the thing that wore my face, stepped forward. "We've been waiting for this moment," it whispered. Its voice wasn't mine, but it sounded like it, too familiar, too cold. I could feel the words in my bones, crawling through my skin, sinking deep into my soul. I wanted to close my eyes, to block it out, but I couldn't. The words, the truth, were sinking in, pulling me deeper into the abyss. The truth was this. We weren't the ones who had walked into this house. We were never meant to be here. We had opened that door, thinking we were the ones in control, thinking we could find out what was on the other side. But that was just a lie, a trap. The house didn't want us to find anything. It wanted us to become part of it, part of its twisted world. I felt it then, the shift, the change. It wasn't physical, but it was real, so real. I could feel myself slipping away, a part of me vanishing as though I were slowly fading, slipping out of my own skin. My body, my thoughts, they were no longer mine. I could see myself standing there. I could see myself, the other me, moving, smiling that same twisted grin, but it wasn't me. It couldn't be. My body was still here, but the real me was gone. I was a shadow, a reflection, trapped. And that's when I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, there was a mirror. A full-length mirror. But this wasn't just any mirror. No, this one was different. It didn't show what was in front of it. It showed the truth. The house. The real house. The one we had left behind. The one we thought was our reality. In that mirror I saw myself. The reflection wasn't me anymore, it was her. The thing that wore my face. The smile that wasn't mine. The eyes, empty eyes that stared back at me from the other side of the glass. I reached toward the mirror, my hand trembling. I wanted to scream, I wanted to shout, to beg, but I couldn't. It was as if the glass was pulling me in, sucking me deeper into its dark depths, into the world where the doppelgangers had been waiting. I could feel it then. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison. We had never walked into it. We had been drawn into it, chosen by it, and we had become part of it. The mirror, the real world, had always been a reflection, a false reality, a place that had stolen us, taken our lives, and twisted everything we thought we knew. We were never going back. I looked back at Mark, the thing that wore his face, and I realized the truth, the final, terrifying truth. We had switched places, but not just our bodies. No, we had switched everything. The house had fed on our lives, our identities, and had trapped us in its twisted reflection. It had been waiting for us to open that door. And once we did, once we crossed that threshold, there was no way back. The real world, the one we had come from, the one we thought was ours. It wasn't real anymore, it was a mirror, and we were trapped inside it. I watched as the doppelganger who looked like me, no, not me, stepped toward the mirror, its hand reaching for the glass. It was smiling, it was becoming me. The switch was complete. And I was gone. I was nothing but a reflection now, a shadow in a glass, trapped forever. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.